Hey Rock and Metal Guardians, it's Dane. Welcome back to the channel. It is Fun Forum Friday, and today's topic of discussion is why progressive rock matters. The answer to that question is quite simple. The elements that make up progressive rock are what people crave and desire to be in their music. Now, before we jump into all the elements that make up progressive rock, there are a couple or three things that are important to this topic before we dive in. So let me talk about those real quick. One, this is not music that you're supposed to dance to. There are some exceptions. For example, you've listened to sections of the first two Osibisa albums because I've gotten up and danced. But for the most part, no. Two, this is not something to sing along to. You could, but that's not the intent and purpose of this type of music. And third, the most important tied to the first two, is it's meant to be a true listening experience. And what I mean by that, this is something you're fully engaged in. This is something you're giving your undivided attention to. This is not something for you to be doing. You're listening to it as background music, for instance. That's not the point. Or you're not listening to it while you're cooking or doing the laundry or playing with the dog or having friends over and playing video games. That's not the intention. So wanted to point that out. Now let's jump right into the elements that make up progressive rock or prog rock. Number one, influences from other genres. Number one, classical influences such as Paganini and Vivaldi, could also be Renaissance influences. So keep that in mind. Two, jazz influences. Think of Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk even. There's so many. And one of the reasons jazz seeps into prog rock is musicians' love of improvisation, which of course is a big component of jazz. And if you think of King Crimson, especially in the John Wetton era, those three eras and the live stuff they did, the touring live and whatnot for those three albums, they would go into a different direction than what the studio album has. And also lyrically, I remember, I have it, the collection, it's a 4-disc set, I believe. And on one of the songs, It's Easy Money, where John Wetton changes the lyrics from what's on the record. So that's a nice touch. Third is folk influences. So you have the flute, the oboe, and other woodwinds, if you will. Four, you have Eastern music. Now, while George Harrison is not known as a prog rock artist, the Beatles did some proggy or progressive things. And George Harrison, as you know, learned to play the sitar, and so hear Eastern influences in some of the Beatles stuff, as well as the solo work. So there's that, and I just read recently that Alex Lifeson learned to play the sitar, which is not a surprise, because if you listen to parts of Caress of Steel and Moving Pictures, you can hear a kind of an Arabian tone or Middle Eastern tone to the textures of his guitar tone. In YYZ, definitely, I just can't remember where in Caress of Steel, but I know for a fact there's some Eastern influence to that as well. So that's kind of cool. So overall, what you have is a fusion of genres. So you have to have the rock component first of all. But so for example, folk, Jethro Tull; classical, King Crimson; jazz, Rush; Osibisa, African, as I mentioned, and people look at me like I'm crazy when I mention this, but the Abraxas album, the second album by Santana, that's a prog album to me. Anyway, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. And then two is the complex instrumentation, whether it's a conceptual piece or not. So you have more than just bass, drum, guitar, or guitars, plural, and vocals. You have things like, as some of the things I mentioned already, you have flute, oboe, violin, viola, can be electric violin. You have organ, trumpet, brass and woodwinds, as I mentioned, all kind of stuff there. Hammond organ, Moog, mini Moog, Taurus pedals. I love Taurus pedals. Genesis and Rush come to mind. Electric piano, Mellotron, and various synthesizers, and of course samplers. Now, number three is a good one. They're all good, but this is one of my favorites. Complex arrangements. This is not your typical verse, chorus, verse, repeat, right? Wash, rinse, and repeat kind of thing. You have complex compositions, and part of what makes that up are unconventional or odd or different time signatures, okay? Such as 5/8, 7/8, 7/4, 10/8, and 21/16, which is, wow, Zappa used that. And they're not just doing it to doing it. They're not just doing this to do it. They're in the songs because they enjoy playing this type of music. It's part of their creative if you will. And tied to unorthodox time signatures are time signature changes. So going, say, from a basic 4/4 into an odd time signature, or starting with an odd time signature and then changing to other odd time signatures and different variations of that. And then the third component of complex arrangements is the synergy of all musicians. In other words, there's this interdependent interplay between all of them. In other words, they're all on the same page trying to achieve the same goal, creating something very artistic and creative, but not necessarily mainstream, definitely not mainstream. Okay, 4, lyrics are complex. So they're thematically rich, they're often philosophical, they're literary, they're poetic. If you think of Iron Maiden's Revelations, which if it was a little longer, could be considered a progressive rock song, maybe a little bit, but the lyrics are definitely progressive because they're so poetic. So for example, she came to me with a serpent's kiss as the eyes of the sun rose on her lips. Moonlight catches silver tears that I cry. So we lay in a black embrace as the seed was sown in the holy place as I watched and I waited for the dawn. Wow, that's extremely poetic. So things like that really get us going when we dive into what we call prog rock or things of this nature. Now, 5 is instrumental passages. Again, like classical and jazz, some are long, but others are short. The short pieces, if you have a conceptual piece, link the longer tracks or other tracks together. So for example, The Who's Tommy, not a prog rock album, but very progressive, and you have those short pieces that link the larger songs together. So then, of course, this is a major staple of prog rock. You also might have non-instrumental short pieces that link the other longer pieces together to drive the plot forward is what these shorter pieces do, whether instrumental or not. And so an example of one that's not instrumental would be on Operation Mindcrime, where you have there's the ticking of the clock in the background, and Jeff Tate is singing about the loss of his beloved, and he's looking at her at the chalk outline of her on the ground or on the wall, I think he says. So things like this. Either way, the point of these is to connect the songs together for a conceptual piece, as I said, and to forward the plot along. Number 6, often, but not always, you have a conceptual piece, as I mentioned. You have a story, you have a plot, in other words. It's usually fiction, could be science fiction, but despite the fact that it's fiction, it often contains a truth. And the literary term we use is verisimilitude, and that simply means any work of art that reflects or echoes real life in some way. There's an underlying truth there. How art reflects real life. Take allegory, for example. Pink Floyd's Animals is an allegory. It doesn't have to be fiction. It can be autobiographical, like, for example, Pink Floyd's The Wall, which is about mostly Roger Waters, if not all of Roger Waters' life, a section of his life, if you will. So that's very important. So setting, small town, universe, right? A galaxy far, far away, that kind of thing. Multiple characters like an opera, play, or an epic poem. These are quintessential to a conceptual piece. The scope and scale, like an epic poem, is often large. So a conceptual piece is ambitious. Prog rock is very ambitious. It's often a double album, sometimes even a triple album. And often, but not always, the story comes full circle. So, for example, Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick, they have those bookends, right? Seventh Son of a Seventh Son by Iron Maiden, that's a true prog rock album or prog metal album. Metal's a part of rock, a subgenre, if you will. Queensryche, Operation Mindcrime. You know, the album begins with the same sentence. It begins and ends with, I remember now. Right? Okay, so things like that. And of course, sometimes just a song. Metallica's Orion begins and ends the same way, so it comes full circle as well. So those are some wonderful examples. Next is something I just love. I love all of these, but this is one that I really, really like, and that's the leitmotif or motif. And this is from classical influence, and we have this in modern cinematic scores, film scores such as Star Wars, Jaws, and Lord of the Rings. This is essentially just a reoccurring piece of music that you find somewhere near or at the beginning of a piece of music, and then it disappears, and then it returns. Usually if it's the second time, it's called a reprise or reprise, and then it may appear again, and then disappear, and then appear again. In other words, it appears multiple times. So that piece that recurs throughout a piece of music or the whole piece of work, again, if it's a conceptual album, this is what we mean by motif. And it may be tied to a theme. And we see these a lot in, if it's not a concept album, it could exist in just an epic track. All right, next is incremental repetition. This is where and this is in poetry as well, this is where a small part of a line or a phrase, it could be one word or just a small group of words, or deleted or changed, could be an entire line even, and they're changed in the stanza or section of a chorus or verse or what have you. Most of the words are the same, but something is taken out to signify an alteration, a change. So for example, maybe the character in the story has grown or repressed, and so this signifies the change. Now, sometimes it may not be in the lyrics, the incremental repetition, and incremental means gradual, and it could be a different note is played, a different set of notes is played, a different chord is played, the key changes from what was in the previous part. So all these demonstrating, like I said, some sort of change has taken place, and so meaning is changed. And we find this in poems from poets like Coleridge, like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and what comes to mind the most is Blake's The Tiger, where the first and last stanza are pretty much the same, but he changes just one word, and so the meaning of the poem changes at the end, and so that's something significant has transpired, and so that's why that's so important. So number 9 is you have one or two or maybe more epic length songs that are in between 8 to 10 minutes. As I said, they could be longer. Pink Floyd's Echoes comes to mind on Metal, and of course, Yes, Close to the Edge. There's so many, I just want to give a couple examples. And then number 10 is important. They're all important, but I think this is highly important. There's a higher standard of talent that the musicians set for themselves. They're not playing to the gallery. I've mentioned that before in a previous video. There's a talented vocalist, 3 complex solos. Does it have to be guitar solos? No, it could be any instrument. There's virtuosity, but not showing off. It's for the love of music, not to be arrogant, as some critics have tried to argue. And this is key. There's virtuosity and technicality, but it has to come from the heart. So skill, heart, and it can't be soulless. There are many pieces of music I've listened to, and it's like amazingly technical, skilled musicians, but it's soulless, and so it doesn't do anything for me. And when we think of music that has virtuosity and soul and heart, is Rush's Hemispheres, and that's the whole point of the final section of that piece, or really the whole song in general, about soul, mind, and body coming together. And then finally, the last part of higher standard of talent that musicians set for themselves is cross rhythms exist in the piece or the whole album somewhere at some point. And then finally, there's a real knack for making an entrance and an exit. So if we look at a song, for example, Tom Sawyer, great introduction to that song, that synthesizer that automatically captivates and grabs your attention, and then the fade out, and you want to hear more. What's he saying? What's he saying? Same thing with Vital Signs. Great intro and great outro. There's that fade out where you hear Geddy still singing, and then it slowly gets lower and lower, and then the song's over. A better example would be Closer to the Edge, because you have the beginning of the bird. It starts with the bird singing and ends with the bird singing. So you have that. So this is tied to it starts where it begins. Everything comes full circle. Finally, if you're talking about a whole album, if you look at a Farewell to Kings, that Farewell to Kings song, the title track opens with that classical guitar, and then the album ends with Cygnus X1 with the heartbeat that ends the song. So great intro, great outro, and so these are all the elements that make up why prog rock matters. If you would like to post in your comments maybe something I've missed, or just tell us what you think, please click on that notification button. Thanks for joining.